In my top prop fantasy article, I had to make a choice. I had to make a choice between Jamar Chase and Stefon Diggs. And I'll actually put that in the comments here, my article. You can see what I said. So I'll talk about these first two, the wide receiver 1 and the wide receiver 2. Okay. Jamar Chase, wide receiver 1 on the week. He had, let me see here, 28.7 half PPR fantasy points, 7 catches on 10 targets, 132 yards receiving, 2 scores, 18.9 yards per reception, 13.2 yards per target. As I said, 28.7 fantasy points. And I wrote in my article that these were 2 top-tier wide receivers, both consensus first-round picks, Jamar Chase and then Stefon Diggs, who we'll talk about next. And I've said Stefon Diggs has already delivered. We've seen 3 top 7 weeks. Add this a 4th top 7 week for Stefon Diggs. And Jamar Chase, he's been a little bit frustrating, for fantasy managers because he finished 4th among wide receivers in fantasy points week 1, but he's finished outside the top 25 every week going into week 6. Now he finishes as the running back 1. T. Higgins did get 10 targets in this game against New Orleans, but didn't do much with it. I think he only had like 48 receiving yards and six receptions. But it's Jamar Chase who's stepped up here. Jamar Chase's target share was higher than Diggs coming into this game. They had the same amount of red zone targets. Jamar Chase had a higher air yard share and a higher true catch rate. But Stefon Diggs had the higher expected fantasy points per game by 0.6 or 0.6 of a fantasy point, and he had a higher yards per route run. I thought that Jamar Chase had felt the wrong side of variance so far, and that his week 6 matchup with New Orleans was going to be very plus because Marshawn Lattimore wasn't going to play for the Saints. So I said Jamar Chase plus 2.5 points in this article over Stefon Diggs, and that seemed to be the right call. Jamar Chase plus 2.5 was a win. So T. Higgins was questionable. No Matt Lattimore. I took the juice between these two, and I didn't need the juice of 2.5 fantasy points, but there you go. The wide receiver 2 on the week, Stefon Diggs, he had a massive, massive game as well. And it's funny that I profiled these 2 wide receivers in the top prop fantasy article that I wrote on Friday night. But Diggs finished with 10 receptions, so more receptions, more targets, more receiving yards, 148, but only 1 receiving touchdown. And that is the difference of 1.9 fantasy point differential between Jamar Chase, who finishes the wide receiver 1, Stefon Diggs as the wide receiver 2 on the week. Diggs, this is his 4th top 7 wide receiver weekly finish, and he was my favorite regression candidate, and not regression as in negative, but you're not going to say positive or negative regression. I had talked about in the offseason that if you saw a 10% dip in elite wide receiver 1 weeks, if you saw a 10% or more dip, that dip on average was 15%. And the next season, those players bounced back and added about 9% more wide receiver 1 week. So 1 or 2 more weeks than the previous season. Stefon Diggs had all of the underlying metrics. He's very well in this conversation as the wide receiver 1 overall. And it would not surprise me if by year's end, he finishes as the wide receiver 1 significantly over whoever's going to be number 2.